This is Toby Eunice with my partner Shelley Carney, and today, if you stick with us, we're going to be talking about interviewing skills. I got a new transition that I have to deal with here. Okay. So, good morning, Shelley. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing great. How are you?
You sound great. You've got a
Thanks.
very nice, your voice has a lot of body to it this morning, so
Okay.
sounds very good. Mine sounds coffee scratchy as usual. Okay, let me just get a couple of things taken care of. So, for those of you who are new to our channel, we would appreciate it if you would like this video. YouTube likes it when you like us. Also, if you would, after the video is completed, share it with your family, friends, business associates, and social networks. And also, if you're not already a subscriber, please subscribe to our channel. And when the notification bell is presented to you, click on the notification bell, and that way you'll be informed when a new video is released or we start a live stream like this one. So let me preface this. I'm about to go to housekeeping, but let me preface this with the idea that this is a program that's very different for a Gypsy's Kiss. Normally we're talking about Forrest Fenn's treasures, but this topic came up a couple of weeks ago in actually somebody else's YouTube channel. And I thought it was an opportunity for us to address it and help the community with something that we wouldn't normally be thought of as doing, but it's in my area of expertise, so we thought we'd share it. So this is going to be a little bit longer than our normal vlog or book club presentation, but again, we want to get this on record, not just for the members of the Fenn community, but so that it could be used by other people who have to do similar work. So let me get to a little bit of housekeeping since Shelley can't actually see the slides on her screen. First of all, I'd like to thank our group of moderators. We are very grateful for their efforts in keeping our chat room moving along nicely. They include Jimmy Fast, Joel Lewicki, Jason Eunice, Brian Eagle, and Eric Schmidt. They are not always in the room at the same time, and of course, Shelley will be performing moderation duties as well today. We'll be doing a presentation on the topic. Shelley is keeping an eye on the chat room, so if you have a question about something I'm saying, make sure you start your question with an @ and a Gypsy's Kiss. And that way Shelley will know it's meant for me and we'll try to answer it. If you just have a comment on what's being said, don't precede it with the Gypsy's Kiss. That way we won't confuse your commentary with a question that needs to be asked at the time that it needs to be asked it. And as a matter of fact, I think what I'll do is, since this is about conducting interviews, be prepared for me to recommend a better way to ask your question should it be required. So let's make this a learning effort as well. And then we'll follow that with open Q&A related to the topic. We are not going to be talking about Fenn today. We're going to be talking about interviewing skills. Now, I pulled this slide, of course, from our slide set, and it says at the bottom we have a giveaway. Today we don't have a giveaway, so this is just an interviewing skills seminar. Okay, so let's take off here. Shelley, you ready to go?
Ready.
All right. So this is what we refer to as our interviewing skills seminar. I had recommended to anyone who was interested in attending the seminar, joining us in the seminar, that they might consider viewing an interview that Shelley conducted back in May of 2017, when she interviewed Thomas Leach, who is the producer and director of The Lure. And the reason I wanted you to see that is Shelley, having taken this course with me when I was teaching at the upublic.tv, took and applied all these skills in terms of preparation and asking questions of the subject. And it was a very good and very informative interview. It goes on for over 20 minutes. So it was very nicely done. So make sure I'll post a link to that video in the description box below after the live stream is processed, so that you can see that particular interview that Shelley conducted, and it's a lesson in itself. So take the opportunity to take a look at that. Hang on, I need to reset one of my screens here. Just give me a second.
William wanted to know if you were this chatty offline, and I said yes, but I have to qualify that. So Toby doesn't just blurt out everything, but if you have a question for him, he will thoroughly answer it.
Yeah. And it doesn't make any difference of the topic either. I'll generally opine on almost everything, which is good and bad.
Well,
Okay.
If I want to have a nice conversation or listen to Toby talk, all I have to do is ask a question.
Yeah, it does. It is the opportunity. Shelley knows that one of my favorite sayings is that I like people who can hold up their end of the conversation, because I feel like I can always hold up my end of the conversation. Okay, let's move on. So again, if you get a chance, take an opportunity to watch that interview that Shelley conducted with Thomas Leach. It's very well done. So let me spend just a minute talking about my background and what qualifies me to do this. Between 1979 and 2010, after I left the National Security Agency, I worked on over 200 editorial, photo, and documentary projects for various agencies in the federal government. And I was a contractor. I wasn't an employee, and I worked out of Washington, D.C. And I had a very good reputation at doing what I did. I traveled literally all over the world. I was in every hot zone from Nicaragua to Afghanistan doing these kinds of projects, and they always involved interviews. And so at some point I had notes and recordings of over 5,000 interviews. It actually is a number bigger than that, but that's kind of when I stopped counting. In addition to that, since returning to New Mexico in retirement, we've done several documentaries. Shelley and I, we've done several television programs, all of which required interviewing. And the other thing about this is, in the latter part of my career, I moved away from the traveling and the documentary making, although I still did it, and I started focusing on consulting with government contractors. And one of the things that I got really good at was building case studies and white papers for contractors that they would eventually use in their marketing efforts towards the federal government. And that in and of itself required another whole new set of interview types, because I would interview their employees on these different programs that they were participating in, and I would then write the resulting case study or white paper for them. So I've done literally thousands of interviews in my lifetime. I've also developed and taught a college level course out in Virginia on interviewing as part of the George Mason journalism program. And then since then, I've taught day-long seminars on interviewing skills and techniques all over the United States. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Shelley is one of the beneficiaries of one of those seminars. And she's, over the years, because of her application of the skill, she's gotten really, really good at interviewing. And I hope you can see that in the interview that she conducts with Thomas Leach. So in this webinar, if you're attending, you will learn how to plan an interview, develop a list of questions, actually conduct the interview, and then process the completed interview. Because very much like filmmaking, interviewing has a pre-production, a production, and a post-production, has pre-production, production, and post-production phases, and you should be aware of all of them. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that every interview you conduct should have all of these components. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that I mentioned, if anything, it should help you ask better, simple questions, so that if you decide you want to write Forrest Fenn and ask him a question, you can use what you learn today in order to ask the question and hopefully get an answer. Because, as I said in the lineup this week, a lot of the questions that are asked just are never going to get answers that are useful to us, if they get answered at all. In addition to that, although I decided to do this as a result of helping the YouTube, the Fenn, Sean Dotson, FenTuber community. Anybody can apply these skills to any kind of interview, whether it's for writing a newspaper article, newspaper or magazine article, building a documentary. You could do it, if you've got cameras and lights, you can use these skills to build out a documentary, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different ways to use these individual skills. And the other thing is, if you're just trying to have a conversation with someone and you want to learn more about them, are you okay? Where are you? I can't see you. So if you just want to learn about someone, this is a good way to learn about them, just by asking questions. And then in the end, we're going to conduct a short live interview with Shelley, where I apply all the things that I tell you about. Excuse me, my throat is just as scratchy as the dickens this morning. Okay, and again, if you have any questions, make sure you ask them in the chat room, and Shelley will make sure that we get them asked and answered before the end of the day. So I had to make some assumptions in teaching this course, this webinar, and the assumption is that you have some sort of credible assignment. That means you have a reason for conducting interviews, one or more interviews, and that can be a print assignment, articles for newspapers or magazines, a documentary that you're shooting with someone else, a case study or white paper that you're writing, or perhaps even an academic, if you're a student, an academic white paper, and you want to make sure that you have credible content for your white paper by interviewing people.
Or you might be promoting your own business on YouTube and interviewing experts.
Right. Now, that's the other thing, too, is this interviewing skill can be used, as Shelley mentions, as a marketing tool, where if you're promoting yourself on, promoting yourself for your new YouTube channel, you could have someone interview you, and that interview becomes what YouTube calls your channel trailer. So there's lots of different ways to use this, because it's all about getting good quality information. My throat doesn't want to clear up. The second assumption is that you've developed a project plan that gets you from the beginning of your assignment to the end. And in that project plan, there's a phase that includes conducting the interviews. And again, I'm creating this scenario for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but it is rare that I conduct interviews without it having being part of a much broader project. A good example is our All About You interview series. That's actually about us wanting to highlight searchers and a much bigger project. And then in addition, it assumes that you have a credible list of what are referred to as SMEs, subject matter expert. These are the subjects of your interview, your interviewees. And one of the things that you're going to do as part of the project, with whether the project is your own or you're working the project for someone else, you'll ask them, who should I be talking to? And then every time you talk to someone, you'll ask them, who else should I be talking to? And those are called your subject matter experts. Last year, Shelley and I did a documentary project for the Ronald McDonald House here in Albuquerque. You can see that on our Video Tarot channel. And the first thing I asked the director after we decided we were going to do this project was, who do I talk to? And she brought in a whole cadre of individuals, both employees of the organization and people who had used Ronald McDonald House for, to take advantage of the services they offer. She made a whole list of them for us. And then, and so we had what were effectively subject matter experts on the topic of the Ronald McDonald House. So that's an important part of the process. So we're going to divide this up into 3 sections. As I said, interview planning, the actual conducting of the interview, and then what you do after the interview is completed. So let's start with interview planning. The first step that I take is I develop an online questionnaire and ask the individuals who I'm going to interview to fill in that questionnaire. Now, I want to make a point, and let me get you to a sample of one of those questionnaires. Just give me a second here. Okay. So in this case, this is my Fenn Treasure questionnaire, searcher questionnaire. And it's the questionnaire that anybody who wants to be on It's All About You or wants to be on one of our panels, I send this questionnaire out. Now, there's an important distinction between this questionnaire that I send out beforehand and the questions that I want to develop as part of the process of interviewing the subject matter expert. This questionnaire, as much as possible, are questions that elicit very short answers, or they are multiple choice. What you don't want to do with your questionnaire is put yourself in a situation, or put them in a situation, where they're going to be answering the big questions that you're going to be asking them when you actually conduct the interview. This is basically a demographic survey that enables them to tell you a little bit about themselves, because that's what the questions are all about. You know, in the case of I ask, because I don't know who I'm dealing with, I ask whether you're male or female, what year you were born, what year you started the search for the Fenn's treasure. And again, these are all multiple choice answers, so they basically click through to give you a basic understanding of a little bit about them, so that when you write the questions for them, you can do it in a more professional way, and you can do it in a way that will eventually elicit all the information you need. So the other important thing is that I put this online to make it available to them. Gosh, my voice even sounds bad to me at this point, so I apologize for this. So let me go back to the slides. I just wanted to give you an idea, and I will put a link to that questionnaire in the description box below so you can get a sense of it. But that's an important part of the process of going through your interview series. So I developed the online questionnaire and to help the subject matter expert fill in the blanks. I contact the subject matter expert to get an appointment. At that point, I also ask them, so I may have either their email address or their phone number. At that point, I ask them for additional information, like if I don't have their email address, I ask for that. Or vice versa. If I have their email address but not their phone number, I ask them for their phone number. I also ask them for the address of the location at which we're going to conduct the interview. And sometimes they'll want to do it in their location, or sometimes they'll look for a neutral location like a Starbucks. And eventually, in the equipment that you use, you'll have to accommodate that you may be doing interviews in public locations. I send the subject matter expert a link to the questionnaire. And what I do is I tell them that in filling out this questionnaire, it will save them time, because it will help me to prepare for the interview. And I literally have never had anyone turn down filling out this questionnaire when I offered it to them. Now, before this, before we had the internet as comprehensively as we do, I would send them a letter containing the questionnaire with a stamped, self-addressed envelope for them to return it to me. So again, the internet makes this much easier and much less time-consuming than it used to take. I put the pertinent interview in my calendar, and I add all the information that I have at that point in the calendar. So when I'm running around with my smartphone using that as a reference point, I'll have everything that I need in terms of the location, the address, the phone number, the email address, the text message address, etc., etc. So rather than having to take all of that with me. And then I review, before I go to visit them, I take their answers to the questionnaire and I review that, so I prepare myself for the interview. Oops, hold on. So once I've done that level of planning, I prepare a list of questions. And my rule, and Shelley will tell you again, support this, my rule for questions is I start with at least 10 questions. You can do more, but generally speaking, if you can get 10 questions out, you'll get the information that you need in order to fulfill the needs of whatever project you're doing. But most importantly, I write questions that enable, and so let me make one qualifier here. I've done as I said earlier, thousands of interviews, and most of them were interviews that were not hostile, meaning I wasn't there to ping the individual, get additional information, and put them in a bad place. There were interviews that were hostile. I interviewed some of the commanding officers on both sides of the Serbian conflict, back in 1995, and those were hostile interviews. But for the most part, in an interview, if it's not a hostile interview, you're going to want to ask questions that enable the respondent to tell their story. You want to start with who they are and how they got to wherever they are based on what you're talking about, the context of the particular story that you're writing, what they think of their present situation, and what their plans are for the future. And as you can see, it has a storyline associated with it, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end is always, where are you going, the equivalent of where are you going from here, or where are you taking your business from here, or what's important about this project that you're working on, and how will it impact people in the future, et cetera, et cetera. So what you want to do is write the 10 questions that enable them to tell a story without repeating the questions. Now, to do that initially, in my experience and my experience with my students, you're going to struggle with that. It's going to seem hard to write the 10 questions that enable the subject matter expert to tell the story without repeating yourself. And so that's when you get really, really good at asking those questions. Now, how you ask them is important because one bad question can destroy an interview, can take an interview from being very productive and very informative to competitive and not informative, and then you're struggling to get out the information from the subject matter expert that you need to complete your interview and maybe even your project. So what I recommend is that you start your questions with one of the following words: who, what, where, when, and how. Now, any journalism major will know that's fundamental journalism, right? That's what they teach you in journalism school. Start with the 4 W's, but they actually say 5 W's, but I'll tell you why not to use that last W in just a minute. So they say 5 W's and an H, and that's what they're talking about. That's how a journalist works. He wants to get who, what, where, when, and how, and that's also how they configure their story. They use that to configure the story that they're writing. Unless the interview is intended to be confrontational, that means beforehand it's going to be a confrontational interview. They know it's going to be a confrontational interview. That's like taking a liberal progressive Democrat and putting them on Fox News, or taking a conservative Republican and putting them on CNN or NBC. So they know it's going to be confrontational, and they know that they're going to get why questions. A why question, no matter how it is spoken, generally will be interpreted as confrontational along a range of parameters, right? So it can be slightly confrontational, or it can be really confrontational and offensive. And a lot of times it will be the point at which you'll remind yourself in later years, that's the point at which that interview went sideways. So I strongly recommend, unless that it is your direct intent to be confrontational, avoid the why question. You don't need it. It can, like I said, it can be interpreted a lot of ways, but most of the time it's going to result in turning the interview in a completely different direction. I also recommend that you don't ask questions whose answer would be yes, no, or I don't know. And the difference is that when you start with who, what, where, when, and how, you're asking questions that are effectively open-ended questions. That gives the respondent, the subject matter expert, the opportunity to answer the question in a way that they feel they're comfortable. If you ask questions that result in answers of yes, no, or I don't know, the respondent will interpret that as you moving them down your agenda. So, and the simplest, and I'll use this example in just a minute, the simplest example of that is you can ask the following question in one of two ways. And the question is, are you a Gemini? The answer to that question is yes, no, or I don't know. But if you were to say, what sign are you? You've given the respondent the opportunity to tell you not only what sign they are, but it opens up the possibility they're going to tell you more about themselves. I'm a Capricorn. A Capricorn is very reserved. Favorite color is brown. Planet is Saturn, etc., etc. Instead of just asking the question that would result in yes, no, or I don't know. And I have seen, I would say that 80% of the questions that are published as questions that have been asked of Fenn tend to be answers that will elicit yes, no, or I don't know. And Fenn is smart enough to write the answer as yes, no, or I don't know with a little bit of a tail end. I'm sorry, Toby, no, I'm not interested, right? Or no, not, I don't mean to make that a bad thing, but that's an example. And then the other thing is to avoid compound questions. Every question should be able to stand alone and upon itself. So you can ask, where are you from? Which is a simple, non-compound, simple question. Or you can ask the compound question like, where were you before you attended this conference, and what were your plans for once you got here? So now what you've done is you've put two questions instead of a single one, and they have to start thinking about one or the other questions to answer. And eventually what you're going to discover is you're going to get to that point. You know, you've asked a compound question when the person says, what was the other question? Where were we going with that? Or because it confuses in the brain, they're trying to answer both questions at once, and eventually they forget what they were supposed to answer. So I'm going to strongly recommend to you that you don't ask the compound question. There should only be one who, what, where, when, and how at the beginning of the sentence, and don't add one someplace else in the sentence because it confuses the subject matter expert and it reduces the quality of the question as well as the answer. So some sample good questions are, these are picked at random, okay? These are questions that I have asked myself, or not myself, but myself have asked, that I have asked. Why am I not saying that right? These are questions that I've asked in my lifetime. When did you arrive in the United States? Starts open-ended, right? Instead of, are you an American, right? That's a yes, no, or I don't know. But you ask, when did you arrive in the United States? They get to tell you their story. How long have you been fighting for the Serbian army? They get to tell their story. What are your plans once you leave this position? Who was the most helpful in advancing your career? When do you plan to move the refugee camps? So these are all open-ended questions that enable the person to continue telling the story that you're there to get. Okay? I think I have some bad questions. Okay, so here's some not so good questions, and I always use this one because it's like, it's a bar question. Are you a Gemini? That'll absolutely get you nowhere because you have a 1 out of 12 chance of being correct, and then a Gemini has a personality that's going to be offended by the question anyway. So so it's a loser if it happens to be a Gemini. Do you think the refugee crisis is hurting your country? You may get lucky and the person may respond with a more detailed answer to your question, but you're just as likely for them to say yes, no, or I don't know. That's the end of that question, and you've just thrown a perfectly reasonable question out the window because you can't ask it a second time. As a matter of fact, again, if you find yourself saying things like, well, what I meant was, and explaining yourself in order to get the question out in another way so that you get a complete answer. When I teach this class, I actually have my students conduct an interview of me in front of the camera, and they get to write 5 questions, and they get to ask me those questions. And anytime they ask me a question that is not open-ended, I answer with a simple one-word answer, the yes, no, or I don't know, and it literally halts, where warm waters do, halts the conversation. It puts an end, it puts a little, as they try to figure out, well, what happened there, and what do I do now? So the best thing to do is avoid those questions. Here's a compound question. When do you plan to take action, and where will they go when you do? And so now that person has to answer at least 2 and maybe even 3 questions, and they're going to lose track. They're going to try and answer one, then they're going to come back and try to answer the other. If you're lucky, if they can organize them in their own head. I once had a student ask a question of a subject, and it was similar to this: when do you plan to take action, and where do they go when you do? And the respondent, the subject matter expert, said, well, that's 3 questions. Let me answer each one in its turn. So first, we plan to take action. And so they stopped the journalist long enough to tell them, no, you just confused me. Let me take those. So it was a very smart thing to do. And again, if you find your subject matter expert or respondent telling you you're asking me complex or compound questions, they're actually telling you to stop asking complex or compound questions. And then the last one that honestly is just as offensive as it gets, it's the why did you do that? Because almost any question that starts with the word why is effectively why did you do that? And it doesn't make any difference what was done. You're questioning everything from the person's credibility to the person's veracity. Now, if you're interviewing Michael Cohen and you want to find out why they did that, that would be a good question for a prosecutor to ask to get that out in court. But that's what it sounds like. It sounds prosecutorial. And so if you're wanting to maintain a high level of mutual respect in the conversation with your subject matter expert, avoid the why questions, because like I said, anytime you ask that why question to their ear, it's going to sound like, well, why did you do that? Even though you don't say it that way. And it may not even be that question. That's how it's going to sound to them. So I recommend to anyone who I'm teaching this course that, again, unless you want to be specifically confrontational with a subject matter expert, just avoid asking why questions. They very rarely help you in the grand scheme of things. So I had to give you an example of a email that I recently got that managed to break all the rules in just a couple of sentences. And I'm going to read it aloud to you, and then you tell me whether or not if you had received this email, because it could be anyone, right? It was directed at me, but it could be addressed to anyone. If you had received this email, whether or not you'd feel offended. The email said, quote, I found it unusual that you chose to leave out the word that is key in your Chapter 16 book club episode. Why did you omit it from your presentation? Are you not aware of it? So when I got this, I don't mind answering emails, but this was so offensive. It made the assumption that I chose to leave out a word that they're imagining in their head because I apparently didn't have the insight to pick the word that they were sitting on the other side of the screen imagining, and then accused me of intent. Not only did I not select the word that they were imagining, but because I intentionally omitted it from the conversation. And then if I didn't intentionally omit it, I must be too stupid to know what the word was that they were imagining. So this was offensive on so many levels. I wrote them back and suggested that they attend this webinar, so you know who you are and I know who you are. So I hope you benefit by this and never write another email like that again unless you're intending to be completely offensive. So. But yeah, I get a lot of emails like that where I am accused of omitting or deleting or intentionally avoiding a subject. And I don't know about you guys, but whenever you're doing what effectively for Shelley and I are extemporaneous presentations, the fact that you may omit something is not intentional. It's simply an extemporaneous presentation. So let's get on to actually conducting the interview. There is technology available now that will enable you to record in a digital format any interview you conduct, and I strongly recommend that you do that. I looked on Amazon last night, and even the Tascams and the Zoom recorders, handheld recorders. You can buy their low-end models with all the features that you'll ever need for around $100. But I found a number of digital recorders of the Olympus pen category for the $20 range. So you have no excuse for not recording this interview. And there's a number of reasons to do that, not only protecting yourself, but protecting the subject matter expert. And generally speaking, although I have had occasion where people will ask not to be recorded, I usually am able to talk them into it by telling them it's important for me to get your story accurately, get it correctly, and this is what helps me do it. And they can choose to go on or off the record. You can give them that option, but it's important for you to get that recording. And of course, if you're doing a documentary, you're going to be recording them on camera anyway. But Shelley will tell you, a documentary, even though it's a visual medium, it's as good as the quality of the audio recordings that you made in that. People will forgive bad lighting. They will forgive, most of the time, bad camera work. What they will not forgive is bad audio. And so do your best to get a quality audio recording, even if you're using a handheld recorder. But don't skip that step. So the process generally goes, you make introductions, there's a greeting and you talk a little bit about each other. And then I start with something that I call the opening gambit. And the opening gambit is a question that puts us both in the mood for an interview. It is one of those questions that begins with the who, what, where, when, or how, and it kind of sets a stage for how this is going forward. And there's lots of opening gambits that you can ask. My personal favorite that has worked for me for years is, how much time have you set aside for today's interview? And not only are you getting information about how much time they've set aside for today's interview, but you're also kind of setting the stage for the way the interview is going to go by asking these open-ended questions. I once had one of my subject matter experts stop me and thank me for even considering asking that particular question, because to them it was an indication of how important I thought their time was. So it's a good opening gambit. You may come up with your own. Use this one. It's worked for me for years. And like I said, it gets me additional information. Now I know how long I have to conduct this interview. Then the next thing to do is, if they are not already familiar with it, spend just a few minutes, and I'm not talking about a 15-minute presentation, literally three to 5 minutes, if 5, I'm going to say under 3 minutes, explaining the context. We're doing a documentary at the request of the director of the Ronald McDonald House here in Albuquerque. They gave us your name as one of the people that we should be interviewing on the subject, because we know, they told us, that you are the parent of a child who was able to use the Ronald McDonald House while you were here attending the University of New Mexico Hospital. And so we want to talk about that particular event and a little bit about your background and how you got to the Ronald McDonald House. So you establish just a little bit of context so they know. And one of the reasons that you do that is it avoids later on in the presentation, in the interview, asking the pre-ramble questions. Now, I'm going to explain what a pre-ramble question is in just a moment, but a pre-ramble question can be very good depending on the time when you ask it, and very good in terms of how the interview goes from there. But a lot of times it has the tendency to stop the questioner, because they start listening to your pre-ramble, and it distracts them from what you're doing here. If you want to see classic pre-ramble, watch almost any set of journalists asking questions of a politician. And the higher up the level of the politician and the more complex the question or the situation, the event, the longer the pre-ramble. Journalists are notorious for that. But they get away with it because they're journalists. And if it's on TV and live, the preamble doubles in size, because that's camera time for them. So I'm suggesting that you limit the number of times you use a preamble, and instead do as much work to establish the context for this interview before you actually start the interview. And then you get through the 10 questions, and you do that ensuring that you get as much information as you can possibly get. If the respondent doesn't completely answer one of your questions, one or more of your questions, go ahead and ask the follow-up. If you have to do a little pre-ramble to establish additional context, you know, we were told that your husband wasn't with you while you were here. How did that make you feel? You know, how much harder was it to do this? So you might have to ask follow-on questions. Feel free to do that. But you should never have to ask more than, say, 1 or 2 follow-on questions. If you ask more than that, there's going to be a tendency to get you off track. And remember what your mission is in terms of the context of the project that you're working. Because a lot of the people that you'll meet to interview, at least in my experience, are really interesting people with varied lives. And all it takes is, you know, the suggestion that they have something else in their life that isn't related to this subject for you to get off track and start going off in Never Never Land. That doesn't help you with the at all with the project. So get through the 10 questions, watch for those follow-up opportunities, but make sure you stay on track so the interview will stay on track. And then, so let's talk about that laborious pre-ramble. It's a play on the word preamble, but I call it, like I said, I call it a pre-ramble. Here's an example. I read the white paper you wrote for The Economist last year, and on page 26, paragraph 3, you stated that a war with Iran was inevitable. And then we finally get to the bad question that results: have you changed your mind on the subject? And the reason it ends up asking a bad question, usually with a yes, no, is you've already asked a question that you think you have an answer to. And so you're going to take them down that agenda based on something that you read, something that you heard, something that you saw, and then you end up asking a question that really doesn't help you in terms of the interview. You could have just as easily asked, how certain are you now that a war with Iran is inevitable in comparison to your 2013 white paper? So now they have context, they know that you read the white paper, and they have a question to work with. And they know, again, that the part of the question requires making a comparison to what they said in the previously written white paper. So if you can, avoid that pre-ramble and instead construct the question that you need to, A, establish context, but ask the question that's going to provide you the information. And as you can see in the way that I composed this question, I actually asked the question first and established the context that would have occurred in my pre-ramble. I did that afterwards. So I asked the question, how certain are you now that a war with Iran is inevitable? And that's the question. I could have actually stopped there, hoping, of course, that they would refer to their 2013 white paper. But I added my post-ramble, if you will, just enough to let them know that I'm talking in the context of their 2013 white paper. Now, another way that I could have done that is I could have started that section of questions by saying, let's go on to the paper that you wrote in 2013. And just kind of change track or do whatever I need to do to let them know. But what they don't want to hear, they're supposed to be the expert, and as long as you treat them like a subject matter expert, they will freely give you all the information you can consume. Once you start behaving like you're an expert in their field as opposed to an expert in journalism, that's going to shut them down. They're going to start going like, this guy just wants to hear himself talk, is what it boils down to, kind of like Toby is right now. So
otherwise known as manslating.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So you just have to be cautious how you do this, when you do it, because it's not going to look good. It's going to sound even worse when you listen to your recording. So then I always set up with a close. Now Shelley and I have talked about sales skills, and we always say you leave the sales call with a close. The same as with an interview. You always leave with a close. I always ask if they have any questions for me. What questions do you have for me? In case they do. And they, I've had everything from what are you going to do with this material, or who else are you interviewing, et cetera, et cetera. And if you can share the information, feel free to share the information that's important to them. Then you ask, how should I contact you? If you don't already have the information, how should I contact you if I have follow-up questions? And you do that not because you don't have the information, but to let them know there is a possibility that you may have follow-up questions after you review your notes and the transcription of the interview. But it's important to let them know that's a possibility, so there is no surprise when you call back. Because if you don't let them know there's a possibility and you call back, they are going to be surprised by it, maybe even perturbed. I don't necessarily think that will happen, but it's always better to let them know that the possibility exists. And then, if you like, you can tell them what happens from this point forward. This is the 5th of 10 interviews that I have to conduct. By the way, I used to say all the time, if I can get 10 people of whom I can ask 10 questions, I can make a documentary short on any subject, and it doesn't make any difference. And I've done documentaries and interviewed people on subjects that I had no idea where they were going, but I developed the questions, and you learn about the subject. Shelley will tell you we've learned more in doing the stuff that we've done together since 2012 about stuff that we never imagined. That's just here in New Mexico, not in Washington, D.C. So tell them a little bit about what happens from this point forward. If they're interested, they may not be interested. And then provide them, I carry a business card that has my name, my phone number, and my email address. And I give it to everyone who I speak to, so in case they want to contact me, or I tell them if you remember other things that you want to add to the conversation. So I give them that, and that happens with every close. So that's how you prepare, conduct, close an interview. And then after you do the interview, there's some important steps that you have to take. So these are the things that I do, but I strongly recommend them after years and years. Number one, I upload and I catalog the digital recording. I can tell you that when I haven't done that, it's cost me. And what I mean by that is when you've got literally a box full of SD cards in various format, the miniature, micro, small SD cards, and each one of them has all kinds of stuff on them. Eventually you're going to lose one, and it's very painful to do that, because the option, of course, is ignoring the interview and not incorporating it into whatever your project is, or calling the person back and saying, I lost your interview, I have to do it over again. There is nothing that will set the tone for an interview than making it the second interview on the same subject. So try to avoid that. So as soon as I get back from the interview, I take the SD card out of the recorder, or I attach the recorder to my computer, and I upload and catalog with details the digital recording. I use a standard file naming convention for every recording. I start with a date, and I do the year, month, date format, because that sorts better. And then the SME's name, starting with the last name and then the first name. There's spaces just in between. And then I place that in the interviews folder, or the recorded interviews folder of the project folder. And the project folder has a name associated with the project folder. And then what I do is I right-click on the interview file, and I open up the properties window of Windows. Now, this may be different for Mac, but for Windows, when you open the properties, it gives you access to the metadata. And I spend time, and it takes 5 minutes, if that, putting in the metadata, all the metadata that I can about this particular recording, the title, which is the subject's name, the subtitle, the rating. It already has the date on which the recording was made. I don't give it a rating, although I guess I should sometimes. And I use tags and comments vociferously. Is that right? Give me a word, Shelley. I use them.
That was a good word.
Okay, all right. The tags are words that describe the interview, the project, the location, all of these things, and you separate them with commas, and as do the comments. And the reason that you get this detail is that although you may search on your computer, and literally I have thousands of these, not to mention thousands of video clips on my computer, and when I need to find one, I can do it by date, or I can do it by name, or because these show up in search, tags and comments, all of these things actually show up in search, or you can list them in your window the window that shows all the files, you can search by any of these and find that particular interview. That's why it's so important to catalog this. Now, this is a still image of the properties window, but you can see there's a scroll bar here that lets you add more information about the particular interview, including the project name, the producer, the director, the audio recording, etc., etc. So I strongly recommend that you take 5 minutes with every file, interview file that you create. And again, if you're doing 10 of them, it's not going to be a big deal. You're going to have one interviews folder and one project folder. But if you ever get to the point where you're doing a lot of these, make sure you take the time to fill out that properties window and add that metadata to the file so that you can find it at a future time. Okay, let me go back to my, oh, that is the slides. All right. So then I have my interviews transcribed. And I use a company called Verbal Inc. They were recently acquired by a bigger company. They're fast, they're inexpensive, and they're exceptional at their quality. And for example, if you're doing an interview and you identify the subjects when you upload your interview, you can upload your interview to the website. Then you choose the time frame if you need it in less than 24 hours. It runs. If I remember correctly, it runs under $1 a page. But let me tell you why this is so important. A transcription of an interview is much easier and faster, not only to review, but to search. And these guys are masterful at doing a quality transcription from a quality recording. So if you're looking for them, they send it back to you in a Word document. So if you're looking for a certain set of a word or a phrase that the subject matter, you recall the subject matter expert expressing, it's a lot easier to find it in a Word document and then relate that to the audio recording than it is to look for it in the audio recording, because the audio recording becomes linear. There's no way to search a digital audio recording for a word unless you put it into, unless you recognize sound waves for that particular word. So the easiest way to do this is by having a transcription of the recording and putting it into Word and doing your search there. Now, if you ask them, they will also document the timestamp for every one of the entries. So every time I ask a question, they put a timestamp in there. It's a little bit extra money, but again, it's worth it. One of the ways that I get around that, if I've forgotten to do that, is I'll look for the phrase and let's say, and I estimate at what percentage it is in the recording, right, in the transcription. So let's say the transcription is 5 pages and it's at the top of page 3. That means I'm 40% of the way through the interview transcription-wise. So I just look at the recording and I look at the 40% point in terms of the time code to find that location. And I'm always amazed that it's within a few seconds either side of it. So that's one way you can do it. But I strongly recommend you go through the process. It's a little bit additional time. But again, they can do it the least expensive. It's based on time. The least expensive is standard transcription in 3 days. And the most expensive, and I believe it's about $1 a page, is I need it in 24 hours and I need a time code. And the subject, the interviewee and the interviewer identified as part of this. So, but again, it makes life so much easier when you're going through dozens of interviews in order to complete your project. So I strongly recommend that you do that. VerbalLink. There are others. I've just used, like everything else in life, I've used VerbalLink for so long, and they're so good at what they do that I just continue to use them. So, okay. So let's go ahead and interview Shelley, and I've got slides here, so you'll be able to see what I'm doing with an opening, a Q&A, and a close. Okay, so let's go. Let's start at the beginning, and Shelley, you are going to go into. Let me make sure I have the right one here. So you can't see, again, you can't see any of this because you're a little bit behind me in the delay, but you did see the slides last night, so you know what I'm going to do. So I'm going to walk Shelley through the process as if this was a complete interview, and you guys are going to see her do it, and you'll see that I'm using the strategy that I recommended to you earlier to do this, okay? So here we are, okay? And I've met Shelley for the first time, and she knows that I'm there doing an interview to help her with her marketing tools, okay? All right. Hi, Shelley. How are you doing today?
Hi, Toby. I'm doing great. How are you?
Very good. So I'm here to do the interview that I contacted you about and asked you to complete that questionnaire. But I want to make sure that it's okay to record this interview. The recording itself will not be used as media. It's just to help me, help to remind me the things that we talked about. Is that okay?
That's okay.
All right. So, well, you know that who I am. My name is Toby Eunice. I work for Gypsy Kiss, and we help YouTube channels get their marketing started. And of course, you contacted us via our questionnaire and said you were interested in having us help you with your marketing development. So how much time have you set aside for today's interview?
Oh, I have an hour, but if we go a little long, that's okay. I don't have any appointments this afternoon.
Okay, I feel like we can get this done in a lot less than an hour. So again, I wanted to let you know that this is part of what we do for you as we help you develop out your marketing. It gives us the ability to understand kind of where your product line is and what your objectives are in growth for your channel. But more importantly, there's some of our users have actually taken this recording and used it as their channel trailer, and you're welcome to do that if you want. So, but I wanted you to be aware of that.
Okay.
So let's get on to the questions and answers. Now, you responded to a questionnaire that we sent you, and it gave us kind of some background information and a little bit more, a better basis for asking these questions. But let me go ahead and ask the questions and, you know, answer them to the best of your ability. I may ask a follow-on question of you if it comes to that. So what is your new channel, The Softer Side, all about?
All right. Well, the softer side offers relationship coaching for men, especially, although we do open it up to anybody who's interested about any kind of relationship. We do focus a lot on single men who need to let go of past relationships so that they can move forward and to have a higher quality life and a higher quality relationship in the future. We also deal with marriage issues in relationships, how to improve that relationship within the marriage. And we can also go into other relationships that exist with family members, but right now we're focusing mostly on those romantic relationships.
So I'm going to go off script here for just a second for our viewers. Two things that I'm going to suggest you avoid. One is commenting on their response unless you have an open-ended follow-up question. So there's no reason for me to go, oh, great, well, that's really good. And secondly, another is to preface your question by establishing your position on the matter. And a good example of this next question that I'm about to ask, I could start it by saying, well, I'm a man. How did you get to the point, you know? So avoid commentary on their responses or commentary related to the question that you're about to ask, and just ask the question. How did you get to the point that you felt you could counsel men on the subject?
Well, it's sort of an experiential thing. I have a lot of friends who are men, and I feel that within a relationship, a lot of times a man feels judged. And with our relationship, because we were friends, he wasn't being judged, and he was more open to explaining some of his goals and some of his problems to me. And I would offer him advice. And when he would take that advice, it would usually help to improve his situation, or it would at least make him feel better. So because I was giving him that listening ear and that support. And because of that, over time, and I would get feedback from these men that it was helpful and they appreciated what I was doing. That is the direction that I went with counseling men.
So what do you have in the way of credentials?
Well, I recently received a credentialing from the Integrative Wellness Academy, so that I am a certified integrative wellness and life coach, and that is just adding on to my experience, a certification that tells people that yes, I have been through the curriculum. I understand what a coach is doing and how that works, and it is also allows me to purchase insurance for my business as well.
When did you realize that YouTube would help you grow your business?
Well, I've been doing YouTube videos for probably about 5, 6 years now. And originally it was just to put up little videos of things I had been working on. And then I started to promote myself as an interviewer, as a subject matter expert. I began to promote myself through my YouTube channels, showing that I had knowledge of the film industry in New Mexico, showing that I had knowledge of working with others who were also in the film industry, and then expanding that out into other subject matter areas when we were doing the live streaming through streaming in Mexico. We would talk with business people. We would go to business events and spread that out, doing interviews of all different types of people and all different subjects. So then I became an interview expert. People would look to me to provide that service. So I could see that YouTube would provide that promotional aspect for the past 5 years. But until we started doing a Gypsy Kiss, we didn't really hit on a winning combination that actually brought in people again and again, those loyal customers who would come back to watch and to learn and to discuss and to grow that community. Once we tapped into that, then we realized how we could do that with other businesses. So I'm attempting to do that with the softer side now.
So where are you going with the channel in the future?
Well, with the softer side, I just started the evening live programs in the last 2 months. We've been working on the live portion of that. Next, I hope to bring in my own subject matter experts, such as other coaches who are experienced in either life coaching or any of the force systems. So I do have a physical trainer who I'm lining up for an interview so we can cover the physical. I would want to cover holistically physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects of relationship coaching or life coaching in general. And because I have hooked into this a group of life coaches who are either students or past students who have graduated or now certified in all these different areas of coaching and life coaching. They might excel in a hypnotherapy, for instance, or working with teenagers, or they have all these different areas that they excel in. So I plan to start bringing them in as subject matter experts and interviewing them and adding that on to the softer side to give a broader appeal for our audience.
Shelley, thank you very much for your time and helping us with this interview today. What questions do you have for me?
So what are you going to do with this interview? What is the final product going to look like?
I'll have the interview transcribed, and that transcription will eventually end up in a white paper that my partner and I are doing on how to take advantage of your skills in order to develop your own YouTube channel. And then how that relates to producing additional income for you. So that's the strategy. But again, since this is your interview, if you would like a copy of the interview, we can provide it to you, and you're welcome to do with it whatever you want, including using it as a channel trailer on your channel.
Oh, okay, great.
So how should I contact you if I have follow-up questions?
Oh, you have my phone number. You can call me or email me.
Okay. And then, so as I said, since you asked the question, I won't repeat the fact that we're going to take this and it becomes, your responses become part of a white paper on the subject of developing your YouTube channel in a counseling business. And we'll not only make each of the products available to you, but we'll send you a copy of the white paper. And then here's my business card. You have my contact information. So let's stay in touch, and I'll keep you in the loop as the project develops, okay? And again,
Okay, great.
thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So that's how it goes. I'm about to go to live chat, and I noticed I wanted to remind those of you that entered the room earlier, I would ask kindly that you not talk about the search. This topic is about interviewing skills, and we'd like to keep it to that. We're not going to address any questions about the search today. So that's how an interview should go. It's that easy if you do the right kind of planning. I would then take that, have it transcribed, do a review, and determine how it's going to incorporate it into whatever product or project that I was working on. So let's go to the chat room to see if there's any questions. Remember that you have the option for using live chat. There's a $ at the bottom of the live chat window. And if you'd like to contribute to our project, whether it's interviewing skills or a Gypsy Kiss, please do so. There, it'll highlight your question. We'll make sure your question gets answered. I do want to let you know that we will not be answering questions related to the Fenn search today in our role as a Gypsy Kiss. Today is about interviewing skills, and if you have those questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So let me go through these. Shelley, I'm going to go back to full screen, and I'm going to open up the chat window, and I think I'll handle the chat from here unless you already have some related questions that need answering.
There's been mostly just comments,
Okay.
so I haven't seen any questions yet.
Okay. So, all right. Let me just scroll down, make sure I haven't missed anything. Yeah, I don't see any questions.
Sean Martinez has told us that he used interviewing techniques frequently in his job as a homicide detective sergeant.
Wow. Well,
he's retired now, but I'm sure that he had some different methodology as well that he would have to use for, like you said, a hostile interview.
Well, that's a good place to be. Probably makes you a better searcher, although that's not the topic today. Okay, so I think that's the end of today's program. I'm going to close up the chat window. Let me make sure I don't have any more slides. No, that was the last slide. All right, Shelley Carney, thank you very much for participating in this interview skills webinar. I really appreciate your time. I know it's off schedule for us, but this is something that I had kind of promised I wanted to do. So,
There's a question.
Oh, a question? Good.
Just real quick. From Sean Martinez. He said, I have found these skills can be useful in reviewing Fenn videos from an interview perspective. Have you? Yeah,
Fenn's a master of not answering questions. Even though he makes you think that he's answered the question. So you always have to look at his responses in any interview from the context of the kind of information that somebody would want if you're an interviewing expert, or if in your case you're a forensics expert. But if you analyze Fenn's interviews, book signings, wherever he's answering questions from a forensics perspective, which is a lot of times what I do, you'll find that his answers are either, well, a lot of ways, and this is not meant to be offensive. That's what he's all about, right? His answers tend to be sometimes evasive, always incomplete, and sometimes what I refer to as counterintelligence with intent. So if you go back and look at his interviews from a realistic perspective about what's the question that you would have asked and what should have been the answer that you expected from it, I have a lot of respect for him when he says, I can't answer that question. Because what he's telling me is that would give me more information about the search, and there's no requirement for him. We're not in court; he doesn't have to answer the questions at all. But he is a master at he's a master of answering a question without giving you the information that you thought you were going to get, but having you walk away with information that you think was good. And a classic example of that is the questioner who asked him, what direction was the blaze pointing at when you left it, north, east, south, or west? And he says, I don't think it was any of those. And so the searcher goes away, and this was written afterwards. The searcher goes away and says, oh, then it must be up or down, without considering the possibility that what Fenn was rejecting, the idea that of the 360 possible directions, he rejected the 4 least likely, that it is somewhere in between all of those directions. So you have to be very cautious. Or when he says, I was in a sedan, well, your first reaction to that, your mental and emotional reaction to I was in a sedan, was to think about a 1958 Chevy Biscayne 4-door bench seats. That's not how a sedan is defined. A sedan is defined as 4 doors and at least 2 seats, a front and a rear. What the chassis is underneath is completely different, which is why you realize finally why he answered that question that way. You thought you were getting information, but in reality, he was keeping information from you. So that's Fenn. Just got to keep an eye on him. He's a tricky guy. Okay, all right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. We hope you found this educational and informative and maybe even entertaining. And we had a great time doing it, and I wanted to make sure that promise that we had made early on was kept. Shelley Carney, thank you for joining me today. And we will see you hopefully all this evening at the panel where we continue the discussion that we started yesterday about whether or not the treasure will ever be found. All right? And again, thanks to everybody, and thank you, Shelley Carney.
You're welcome. Thank you.